Okay, so for those of you who haven't been here recently, we are going through Hebrews 11, and we're talking about everybody listed in Hebrews 11. So, Hebrews 11 is where we're going to start. So Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the substance or the realization, the reality of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it elders obtained a good testimony." So then the rest of the chapter continues with the elders that received a good testimony because they had faith. And last week we talked about Jacob, Esau, and Isaac. So go ahead and go to Genesis 37. We're going to talk about Joseph. So if you remember, there was this guy named Jacob who's a little bit of a manipulator, tricked his older brother out of getting his birthright and his blessing. And we saw through how his life, he just kind of thought of God as his father's God, but by the end of his life, he thought of God as his God, and God really took care of him a lot. And we see him being blessed and prospering. He had so many children. He had 12 male children and female, so he had many babies. But if you remember, he was working for this guy named Laban because he wanted to marry this girl Rachel. And then on his wedding night, Laban tricked him and he ended up getting Rachel's sister, Leah. So then he had to work 7 more years and he finally gets Rachel. So Rachel, the wife he really likes, and Jacob, they had a baby, and his name is Joseph. And that's what we're going to talk about, is this guy Joseph. So what happened was Rachel died after giving birth to 2 sons. So Rachel's no longer with the family, and so Jacob really loves Joseph because he loved Rachel so much. And there's the famous story of how Joseph's got this brightly colored coat. Most people have heard of Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you don't know much about him, prepare to learn. Genesis 37 is where we're going. I'm in Exodus. Okay, hold on. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. All right. So, Jacob. 30, verse 1. Now Jacob dwelled in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Beali and the sons of Zilbah and father's wives and words I can't pronounce. So Joseph brought a bad report to his father. All right, now 3. Now if you remember, God changed Jacob's name to Israel. So if we read the word Israel, we're talking about the guy Jacob. Okay, because remember, God changed his name. So if you weren't here last week, you can read the first few chapters before this to get caught up. So, okay, so verse 3 says, "Now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than all of his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. And when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his other brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him." So this is why they hated Joseph. It wasn't because Joseph necessarily did anything, but it was because their father favored Joseph over all of them. Okay, so that sparked their hatred towards this guy. So now in verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So remember, their hatred towards him started because of preferential treatment, but then continued because they didn't like this dream that Joseph got. Verse 6. "So he said to them, 'Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There were we binding how do you pronounce that? Sheaves? Yeah. Sheaves in the field. Sorry, brain fart. Okay. So they were binding sheaves in the field. They then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaf stood all around mine and bowed down to my sheaf. So basically a sheaf's a bunch of like not wheat, but like that wheat-like substance like this that you see, they put it in a circle and everybody gathers it up. And then so his grew up tall and all the other ones bowed down to him. So you get that mind picture. And verse 8, and his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. And then he dreamed still another dream, and told it to his brothers, and said, look, I've dreamed another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? So you, your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept that matter in mind. So, point taken here, God showed Joseph a dream. Okay, he's 17 years old. So remember that. At 17 years old, God's showing him these things. And he's very convinced this is God showing him these things. And his brothers didn't really like it. I don't know how many of you have siblings, but imagine you having 10 older brothers, and then your younger brother is like, oh yeah, I had this dream that you guys are going to be like bowing down to me. That doesn't really go over usually in sibling relationships when you're growing up. So, yeah. All right. So, okay. So anyway, his brothers, got even more mad at him. So they're not liking him day by day. They're finding new reasons to not like him. So whether Joseph was telling his family this out of pride or whether he was just telling them, he told them all about the dreams and they didn't like it. But there is one thing we're going to learn about Joseph is that he is a godly man. And he had a lot of pretty horrible things to happen to him. But we see that he doesn't give up, and we see that he doesn't complain about it. He's not wallowing in self-pity, and he doesn't give up. So Joseph is one of the few men in the Bible who has basically his whole life written about. We see him from the age of 17 till his death. We don't get to see every person's life like that, but we get to see all of Joseph's. And what's really cool about this is that in this record of Joseph, God doesn't rebuke him ever, which is kind of a big deal because we read a lot about Moses, but Moses gets rebuked. We read about a lot about David, but David gets rebuked because they all kind of do these big mess ups and then God gets them back on track, which is cool because we can then never mess up and then get back on track. But what's cool about Joseph is he never has that. He walks with God his whole life. We don't see any big thing where God has to send a prophet to be like, hey, don't be sleeping with people and murdering people or, stuff like that. Okay? So, back to the God gives Joseph a dream. So, God gives him a dream. Now he's got a choice. He can either remember the dream or forget the dream. Okay? I know that seems kind of like, okay, duh, but think about it. We are given all sorts of things that God's given us. So we can choose to remember or forget them too. So Joseph, we're going to see, remembers these dreams. Joseph doesn't have a written down book filled with a bunch of promises like we do. He's got the sky and the Messiah stories written in the sky. He sees that God blessed his dad a ton. But God then shows him something early on in life that he's either going to have to accept or reject. He could have just had that dream and been like, no, that's crazy. And then we probably wouldn't be reading about him. But he accepted that. So when God shows us stuff, like what's written in the Word, we got to accept it. We got to make it our own. Because if not, it'll just kind of fade away to nothing. So, back to Joseph. Joseph's brothers were not awesome people. They killed a bunch of people. There was some rape. They were overwhelmed with jealousy. They weren't the most awesome people, okay? So the older brothers want to kill Joseph. We're not going to read everything. I'm going to summarize what happened. So 10 older brothers, they want to kill Joseph except for one of them. One of them's like, let's not kill him. But the other 9 are like, no, kill him. So they decide they're going to throw him in a pit. And then they actually end up selling him as a slave. So they take his pretty coat that's full of colors. They smear animal blood on it. They bring it back to their dad. And then they sell Joseph into slavery. So go down to verse 34 of Genesis 37:34. Then Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned for his son for many days. And all his sons and daughters arose to comfort him, and he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down to the grave to my son in mourning." Thus the father wept for him. So his dad's refusing to be comforted, and the kids rise up to comfort him, but they obviously are not really trying to comfort him, because instead of telling him the truth, like, hey, actually your son's alive, we just sold him, they just don't say anything to him. So they're really not really awesome kids. Yeah. So verse 36 says, but now the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of his guard. So meanwhile, while dad is grieving, Joseph's being sold into slavery. Which is kind of cool to think that, sometimes we don't want to jump to conclusions. Jacob jumped to conclusions. Like, yeah, the evidence was very strong that his son was dead, but that might not be the case. So don't always jump to conclusions and, go to the worst possible scenario and dwell on that, because you know what? Maybe your son just got sold into slavery. All right? All right. We're going to skip 38, go to 39.
I hate when that happens.
It's a real bummer. 39. We're going to skip 38 because it just talks about how crappy Joseph's brothers were, and we're not going to talk about them. We're talking about the faith Joseph had tonight. All right. So, verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was prosperous. Okay. He's a slave. He's just a slave. And God is saying Joseph was prosperous. That word, it means to advance, to prosper, to make progress, to succeed, to be profitable. 5 senses rise. He went from the top of his father's house being like the best son ever. He didn't even have to go out to work. He stayed at home and hung out and was just living the life, to being a slave and getting ready to be sold into slavery. So by 5 senses, it doesn't look like he's prospering, but God's calling him prosperous. So there's something more to prosperity than the circumstances of your life. So Joseph was a slave, and God's going to help him prosper as a slave. God can help you with whatever circumstance you are now. If you get sold into slavery tomorrow, you can prosper as a slave too, okay? So Joseph had an opportunity to complain and to give up. He had an opportunity to just feel sorry for himself, to feel bad, but he didn't. He remembered the dreams that he was given by God, and he saw God prosper him. So verse 2 again, it says, "And the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did." God prospered him so much that his Egyptian master, who didn't worship God at all, saw that Joseph was being prospered by God. He was like, whoa. And so he gives him a lot of cool things. All right. 39. Andrew, will you read verse 1 through 6 for us, please, of 39?
Sure. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him of the hand of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he, Potiphar, made him an overseer of his house. And all that he had, he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored.
Or in normal English says Joseph was handsome in parents. So basically, God prospered him so much that he became like the head of that household. Like, that's pretty good for a slave. Like, he could have been like working in the field, digging holes, picking up horse crap, washing dishes. But no, he rose so much because God prospered him, that he was the head of his house, the head of working household, basically. And Potiphar could just take it easy because he trusted Joseph completely. Like, God is prospering him. And then the side note there, verse 6, it says that Joseph was handsome. And that gets him into a little bit of trouble here. So, verse 6. Oh, no, 7. So, 7. So it came to pass, after these things happened, his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and that he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in the house than I, nor has he kept anything back from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he would not heed her, to lie with her or to be with her. We see he's a man of integrity. He's a godly man. He doesn't want to sin against God. He doesn't want to be crappy to his master. He's doing the right thing. And verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do work, and none of the men of the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment and said, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. Sometimes it's good to run from temptation. Like, leave your crap behind and just book it. It's okay. There's no shame in that. Just get out. Okay. Verse 13. And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside. Then she called to the men of the house and said, See, he has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us, and he came to lie with me, and I cried out in a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice, he cried out, and he left his garment, and he fled and went outside. So she kept his garment until his master came home, and then she told her husband, and her husband believed her, and he got real mad and put Joseph in prison. So, that sucks. Joseph was being an upstanding man, gets thrown into prison. So once again, he's got an opportunity to feel sorry for himself, to complain. Because he finally was making it as a slave. He had a good life as a slave, and then he gets sent to prison. And this wasn't like a nice prison system like we have. It was dirty and disgusting and an ancient prison. It wasn't a nice place. They didn't have electricity down there. It was not pleasant. So now he gets sent to jail, being an innocent man. So he had a choice to be bummed out and give up, or to keep on giving thanks to God and not complaining. So verse 20 is where Andrew, or actually, does anybody else want to read?
I'll read it.
All right, Tiff, will you read 20 through 23 for us?
Sure. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound. And he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper.
Isn't that cool? So now he's prospering in jail. Wherever this guy goes, he prospers. All right? That can be us too. Wherever we go, we can prosper. So different jobs, different stations in life, sold to slavery, thrown in prison, whatever, God can cause you to prosper. The key is to not wallow in self-pity, but to keep looking to God. And God gives this Joseph great grace. I mean, he's the second in command of prison. I mean, usually you don't give that to a prisoner, all right? But the prison warden was like, man, God's really with this guy. I'm seeing, I don't know how you prosper in prison. Like, I don't really know what that means, but like, it was happening. So, Joseph becomes the most successful prison mate. So, we see him being successful. He asked, never mind, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, chapter 40. So, it came to pass that after these things, that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. So the Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker, so he put him in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. So apparently Joseph's taking care of the prisoners. I don't know if he's bringing them food or whatever, but he has interaction with the prisoners. He can move throughout the prison. Verse 5, then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, both had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. So Joseph has some interaction with him. If you remember, Joseph is fairly familiar with dreams because he had a couple dreams. And he's still remembering his dreams. He obviously has a pretty cool relationship with God because God keeps prospering him and keeps showing him grace and mercy. So let's go ahead to verse 20. So he's hanging out with these two guys. He tells them the interpretation of the dream. And one of them in 3 days is going to be restored to his position as cupbearer. So he's the king's cupbearer. In 3 days, he gets to be cupbearer again. And so the other guy's like, okay, tell my dream. And Joseph's like, well, in 3 days, you're going to die. And so in 3 days, that's exactly what happens. So what Joseph goes to God. God gives him the interpretation of the dream, and then it comes to pass. So, verse 20 says, now it came to pass on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up his head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. And then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. That's what his chief butlership was. He handed Pharaoh his cup, made sure it wasn't poisoned, gave it to Pharaoh. And verse 22, and he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. But the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So what happened was, Joseph was like, hey, when you get restored back to being the chief butler, remember that I'm down here. Remember that I'm a good man. I interpreted your dreams like I'm a prisoner, but I'm working the prison. But as soon as the butler got back up out of the prison, he just forgot about Joseph. He just moved on with his life. So Joseph could have become bitter over that. He could have let some brood of bitterness come in his heart, but you know what? He didn't. And verse 1 of chapter 41. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. So here we are, 2 years later. Joseph's still down there in prison. We don't know exactly how long he's down there. But for at least 2 years after this guy, he's still in prison. Pharaoh had a dream. All right, so the plot thickens. All right, Pharaoh's going to have a dream. Lots of dreams in this. Who was the other person who wanted to read? Joey, would you read 2 through 8 for us?
Sure. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and the lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7